Next, we'll talk about managing user accounts. So a user account is basically is an account assigned to an individual user, which will be used to log in. There are different types of user accounts. The most basic type is a local account. So local accounts are not in Active Directory; they only exist on a local computer, and the account information is stored in the Security Accounts Manager (SAM) database. So local Windows machines that are not part of a domain will always store everything in the SAM database on the local computer. But if it's in a domain, then it's going to be in the Active Directory database, which is a little bit different. By default, most computers have local accounts. Even if they're joined to a domain, there's going to be a local account. In fact, it's important to understand that these local accounts exist because you'll have both a local administrator that has full access to everything on a computer, but a domain administrator has access to everything on the domain. Um, so they're different, right? So you might have an account called administrator on a computer that's in the SAM database. So if the user does not log into the domain, they can log into the local computer using the local administrator, but they won't have any access to anything on the domain, just to things on the local computer. There are certain times when you might need to do that. Um, and usually that account is if you're security conscious or you have a particularly high security posture, you're going to rename that local administrator account and use a very strong password. And likewise, a domain administrator account, you would do the same thing. You would also want to rename the domain administrator account because it has access to everything in that domain. And you would make sure again that you have a very strong password, and you may even want to rename that account as well to something something that's a little more secure, that somebody couldn't guess. Obviously, if you leave it as administrator, anyone who's trying to attack your network is going to know that you might have an account called administrator, so it's one less thing they can attack. But what you cannot do is you cannot remove or disable or delete the administrator account, either the local administrator or the domain administrator. They cannot be removed or deleted or disabled. So all you can do is change the account name and change the password to something very complicated or a strong password, which is highly recommended. So there's certainly something you would want to do. As far as user accounts go, there's also a built-in guest account in Microsoft Windows. The account is very limited, so it can only access. So the guest account can only access anything in the everyone group. So any object or principal that has permission to the everyone group, a guest account will have access to that. Does that mean we should leave it enabled? Probably not. Most organizations try to disable the guest account. But you could leave it enabled. If you are going to leave the guest account enabled, it's generally a good idea to rename the account so it's not so obvious. Again, an attacker might just use the guest account to try to access resources because they know that it might be enabled by default if you haven't changed that setting. The thing about the guest account is, while it can only access the everything group or anything that's assigned to everyone, you'd be surprised how many things get assigned to everyone. A lot of times when administrators are having difficulty assigning permissions to something, they'll assign it to everyone just to bypass all of the challenges that they're having. And we'll talk more about that with group accounts and group policy later on. So again, it's a good idea with user accounts to ensure that, or with group accounts, that you either rename it or disable it. And of course, disabling it is recommended, although you should probably do both. So you can manage user accounts in Active Directory from the user account administration. When you go to create a user account, you're going to have to ensure that you have a account name, which is the same as the login name. They are not case sensitive and can be anywhere from 1 to 20 characters. And it's generally a good idea to have a standard naming convention, such as first initial, last name. You may notice at Drexel we have a naming convention for our user accounts, and of course, they really kind of stem from the Unix system that they're created on, but it's the same concept. There's some system that you use to create these user accounts to ensure that they're somewhat unique and predictable. So use some kind of convention. By default, you have to use complex passwords, and by default, only the login name is required to create a user account. So just some very basic information. You can also provide a full name. You can also provide a logon name if you're going to allow pre-Windows 2000 logon. You'll have to put in the password twice to make sure that it is that you put it in correctly. And then there are 4 checkboxes. The user could either be required to change their password on the next login, or they cannot change their password. You can make it so the password never expires, or you can disable the account when it's created, which you would do for a variety of reasons. And this is what the dialog box looks like when you're creating these accounts. You can also disable user accounts. You might do that when a user has left the company, or the account is not ready to use yet. For example, a new employee that won't be starting until next week, or if a user is going on some extended leave, maybe they're going away for the summer or something like that, which periodically happens at places like Drexel. And aside from using the Active Directory user console, you can also use the PowerShell to enable accounts. So there's a PowerShell command, and you'll see a bunch of these throughout the quarter. I'll talk about some of these PowerShell accounts, and you can do a lot of automation with the PowerShell accounts. But also, as you recall from the previous unit, we won't talk about this very much, but as you recall from the previous course, to which this course is a follow-on, that starting with Windows 2012, there is a heavy reliance on using Server Core, which does not have a UI, so there's a lot of things that you'll be able to do from the PowerShell rather than having to use a UI. You can also use the dsmod user command to modify an existing user. Another useful feature is creating a template. So if you find yourself creating user accounts frequently, you can create a template account. It's generally good practice when you create a template account to prefix the username with an underscore. That way it flows to the top of your list and you don't have to scroll down to the T's to find your template. But that is if you named it template. But basically a template account has all the common information that is really not going to change that much between different users. Or maybe you would put some placeholders in, so it's easy to know, to remember what you're going to put in those positions in the schema. And then whenever you create a user, you can use that template to create a new user account, and everything will be filled in for you. So it kind of makes things go a little bit faster. So that's certainly one thing you can do. You can also modify multiple user accounts at the same time. So you can highlight multiple accounts, and when you do that, you'll be able to add them to a group all in one fell swoop, or you can disable accounts in one group of user accounts. You can enable all of the accounts at the same time, move them to other groups and so forth, send them email, cut, delete, or look at their properties. And some properties you will not be able to change as a group, but you could do that. So when you look in the properties and account properties, there's a lot of information in here. You'll be able to reset the user's password. You can rename their account. You'll be able to move the account or objects, which we'll talk about later on, some of these other objects that might work with. Under the General tab, you have their display name, email address, the web page, if you want to add that. A lot of this stuff is optional. The only thing that's required to create a user account is the logon information. So the display name isn't necessarily required, but it's generally a good idea to provide that information. And under the Account tab, again, here's more optional information that you could add. For example, you can make it so that an account can only log on during certain hours of the day. So for example, this account is not able to log on between 12 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. or 3 a.m. rather. So between 12 and 3 they can't log in, but any other time they would be allowed to log in. Or I'm sorry, I have this backwards. They're only permitted to log in from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. Not sure exactly why you would do that, but I suppose you could. Although it would be more common here is if you're going to not allow people to log in outside of business hours, for example. There may be no reason for somebody to be logging in the middle of the night, so you could disable the account in the middle of the night automatically. So if they try to log in at midnight, they wouldn't be able to do that. And under the Profile tab, you can add some information about what to do with the user account when they log on. This is where you put in the logon script. You can define their local path, which is where their home folder is. So this would allow you to relocate home folders to, say, a UNC path or an SMB share, which we talked about in the previous course a little bit how that works, but we'll revisit that again, of course, in this course as well. Or to map drive letters. So you can automate some of the things that the user will need when they log on. And again, this is where the template user comes in handy. You can set all of this in the template user. That way, it's automatically configured for you each time you create a new user account. In the Member Of tab, this is where you're going to assign the groups for a user. Now, you could use the Groups tab to put users in the groups, but you can also do this from the Properties tab in the user account. There is a checkbox for set primary group, but that's only needed if this particular user is going to be logging in from Mac, Unix, or Linux client computers. If they're only going to be logging in from Windows, you don't have to set the primary group. You don't have to select the primary group button. And then finally, we have the contacts and distribution groups, which is typically used when you're integrating with Microsoft Exchange. If you're not using Microsoft Exchange, there probably isn't much reason to complete this additional information. And again, none of this is required, but this is good if you're using Exchange, if you want to allow users to search the directory, for example. So if you work for a particularly large company, sometimes it's helpful to be able to use the directory to find somebody's email address instead of going and looking it up somewhere else. So you can integrate something like that by adding that additional information. All right, so in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about managing group accounts.